Okay, so welcome everyone to an evening with Wild Welfare. We're joined by some of the team, not all the team. Unfortunately, not everyone can be with us. So we've got Victoria and Sophie not joining us, and Margaret Whitaker as well from Wild Welfare US. But we've got myself, Simon Marsh. We've got Georgina Groves, who's one of the founders of Wild Welfare and animal welfare consultant. We've got Sarah Bonza Blake, who's our animal welfare field manager, and Dave Morgan, who's another founder of Wild Welfare and the field director, and Dr. David Jones, who's the founder and the chair of the Board of Trustees for Wild Welfare UK. So this is recorded, and we're going to have a few questions circulated around. Sarah's going to put some questions to the team, and then by all means add your own questions, and please ask us anything about Wild Welfare or anything else you'd like to ask us. This is an opportunity to get to know us and sort of engage with our friends and family and supporters and donors and everyone else that's joined the call. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to our trustees, our advisors, and our volunteers, past and present. So you know, they are all part of the team, as it were, but today we've just got the five of us. So
I think there's a few volunteer names in the participant list as well. So hey guys, thanks for your help.
Excellent. Yeah, good you could join us. So I think I've covered everything housekeeping wise. So Sarah, would you like to start with some of the questions?
Okay, so let's go for a question to let's go with George first. So George, what has been your best experience with the charity so far?
Oh, Sarah, thank you. Didn't realize I was going to be first. Now I've got to think about this. My best experience. This is really hard because there have been so many fantastic firsts when you found a charity, and you co-found a charity, I should say, really. There are so many firsts. And so actually, one of the best experiences is actually quite trivial, but it wasn't at the time. And that was seeing the Wild Welfare logo for the first time on a banner at a really important conference in Vietnam. And it was the first time that it became really real to me that Wild Welfare was an organization, that it was representing people who think like me, who are trying to do their best for wildlife, and seeing it up there at this conference was just an amazing thing for me in terms of all the work that we had all done to get to that point. So yes, trivial in terms of it's just a name, just a logo on a banner, but it meant so much in terms of the steps that Wild Welfare had made to get to that point, to be recognised and have their logo on the banner. Perhaps a little more exciting for everybody else is and probably no surprise to anybody on this panel, is rescuing the bears from Japan. So back in 2016, I think it was, that I first met 4 brown bears in Japan. They were kept in a small facility, which was actually a museum, in tiny cages, and we worked really closely with a number of Japanese organizations to try and relocate these bears, and with the owners of the bears who wanted them to go to somewhere nice. And unfortunately there was nowhere in Japan that could take them, and so we were incredibly grateful for a park in the UK, Yorkshire Wildlife Park, who agreed to take the bears back home to them. And so myself and a few other people, including Simon, went out to Japan in 2018. I think it was a heat wave as well going on at that time, so that was fantastic, and we hadn't booked accommodation, so we ended up in a youth hostel, and we brought these bears home. And I'd never been part of something like that, and I remember getting up, I think it was 3 in the morning, where we all had to do sort of a debrief, or pre-brief I should probably say, of how we were going to do this, and men walking around with hunting rifles at sort of 3 in the morning in case the bears got out. And it was all just incredible experience. And I remember staying in Japan. Simon was lucky enough to travel back with them, staying in Japan whilst they traveled and climbing up a mountain because I was so nervous about their journey home, and then finding out that they'd all made it back to Yorkshire Wildlife Park successfully. And then seeing them in Yorkshire Wildlife Park when I got back and seeing them touch grass for the first time and all of that, it was just the most amazing experience to be part of. So yeah, that was one of them. And then finally the people, but I won't go on about that for now, but the people I've met, the people I've worked with, including everybody in this panel, has been fantastic. Really learned a lot from everybody in many different ways, and some incredible people who stay below the radar, who I've also learned from. So yeah, people, bears and logos. There you go.
I love it. I love that video you sent me ages ago of you telling one of the bears that they were going to a new home and describing how they were going to have a soft bed for the first time and they were going to be able to dig and all of these really simple things. And I'll never forget seeing that video. It's a very...
I was trying to tell myself as well at the same time, because it was still sort of like, will this ever happen? It was such, no animals, no bears had ever left Japan like that before. And it was the first time for many people to be involved with this. And yeah, it was, until it actually happened, I always thought, will it actually happen? So I was probably trying to tell myself that too.
And it took how many years?
So from the first time I saw them to when we actually managed to move them, it was about 2 years, because of the way that wild welfare works is obviously being very collaborative and supportive of other organizations. And we didn't want to just take these bears. We didn't want to just assume that we could take them. So we were trying to work with obviously all the local experts in Japan to find them homes there if possible. So it took a while, but it was worth it. Amazing.
Oh, thanks, George. So my next question is for Dave. Have you got an individual animal that you remember from working with the charity that's kind of stuck in your mind?
There are so many, Sarah, but just listening to George right now, George, you keep talking to bears. The second they start talking back to you, you let us know, all right?
Will do.
Yeah, probably to give a little bit of background about myself, I'm actually a reptile guy. I'm a herpetologist. That's how I kind of came into this industry in the first place. So, you know, reptiles will always remain very, very close to my heart. But thanks to wild welfare and some of our colleagues, I find myself very rarely working with reptiles anymore, and elephants now suddenly have completely superimposed themselves onto my life, and in particular Bornean elephants in Sabah in North Borneo. And there is one individual elephant there that will always stand out in my mind when I think of the Sabah elephants. And he's an elephant. He's now 14 years old. His name is Ganesh. And he lives at Langkawi Wildlife Park, which is operated by the Sabah Department of Wildlife. Now, back in 2019, myself and Margaret Whitaker from Wild Welfare US, we had started a project there of moving the Langkawi elephants into protected contact management, which is a particular style of elephant management best suited for zoo environments. It allows elephants to be elephants, and also ensures a higher degree of safety when actually working with these animals. Protected contact obviously means that there is usually a barrier or distance between yourself and the elephant, which is completely different, of course, to the more traditional methods of elephant training, otherwise known as free contact, where you are actually sharing the same space with the elephant. And in order to maintain your control over the animal, you have to insert yourself into its social hierarchy and be completely dominant. Protected contact, of course, is almost the complete reverse of that. In any event, we started training 2 young elephants at Langkawi in a particular area. And there was a 3rd elephant in there, and his name was Ganesh. But at the time, we weren't focusing our attention on him. And Ganesh actually didn't seem to like this very much. because he would hover around in the background whilst we're training the other two. And eventually, around about the fourth day, he stepped forward and pushed one of the younger elephants out of the way and stood in front of me and just simply looked me in the eye. Now, one isn't supposed to be anthropomorphic about this sort of thing, but there was something going on in that elephant's mind. And the way he looked at me, so I offered him a target, because we were target training the other two young elephants, and he responded to it immediately. He had learned to do that simply by watching us working with the other two elephants. And it was an absolutely mind-blowing experience, where he was exhibiting his degree of absolute cognitive function, coming forward. I want to join in, I want to be part of this, and I've already learned how to do it by just simply watching you guys. And I've just come back from Sabah, actually, and we've been working again with Ganesh, and he's accelerating through the protected contacts, the positive reinforcement training in an absolutely breathtaking manner. So Ganesh will always be close to my heart. And of course, he's a Bornean elephant, so he's, comparatively speaking, a little elephant. He's as tall as I am. But yeah, Ganesh will always be close to my heart. He's a wonderful elephant.
It does sound incredible. I'd love to meet him one day. Well, thanks for sharing that story with us, Dave. Okay, so the next one would be for David. So what are your hopes and aspirations for the charity in the future, given that you set it up 10 years ago?
Well, oh my goodness, yes, I mean, what we know is that there's a huge demand. We knew that, of course, when we started Wild Welfare, but I mean, as we've gone along, we know that there's a huge potential demand, both from the point of view of working, you know, to even greater depth with the folks we already work with, and if we were able, with the adequate resources, to go out and proactively bring in more partners, if you like, then we know that they're out there. So that is not going to go away. That's going to increase probably as the resources that we can attract can also increase, because obviously this is a very people intensive business, and so it's really critical that we grow the resources in order to support that. I think another major factor, of course, is the use of partners. I mean, partners in the sense of being other providers. We already, as you know, have a partnership program underway, but I think the potential of that is very much greater than it is at the moment. But again, it's something, and I know we've talked about this, something where we probably need a committed member of staff to be in charge of that program. But the value of that, and those partners are going to be major institutions, zoological aquarium institutions. But what's important is that we have partners who actually believe in what we believe in and in the way that we do it. What we don't want, of course, is partners who rush off in a different direction or have different standards or just want to do it on their own. It's very important that we maintain a wild welfare standard, which then we can't impose them on partners, but we expect that partners that work with us will work with us to develop those standards. We need to be well up with the science of animal welfare. It's extraordinary. I mean, I've been in the zoo world in one form or another, zoo world, wild animal world, for golly, nearly 60 years, dare I say it. And what has happened in that time, in those decades, is extraordinary in the way of animal welfare. When I started as a young vet straight out of college in the late 60s, welfare was not a topic that people talked about, and certainly not with wild animals. There was a certain amount going on academically with domestic animals, but when you think what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years in terms of the academic side of what of the knowledge that we have, not only in that sort of purist academic side, but the sort of work that we're doing, and in a way, Dave's just illustrated that, the way that we learn, the team learns. And of course, what we've got to do, and we're not so good at that right now, is actually publish make our experiences more available to folks who might want to join in. It's as we've said many times, a lot of what we do has to do with dealing with people. Not, of course, it's dealing with animals, it's dealing with the people who are responsible for those animals. And in many of the countries that we work in right now, the ones we currently work in, maybe that has huge challenges. And nobody else, frankly, no other institution in the world has developed the sort of experience that we have in the sort of personal approaches, whether that be directly the animal care person directly in charge of that elephant, or whether it happens to be the governor or the minister or somebody in ultimate authority who may not necessarily agree with a lot of what we want to do, and that handling those people is quite a challenge. Finally, we need to stay small. Too many organizations, too many not-for-profits sort of grow in the sense that their ambition is to recruit 100 staff. We will never be that. It's really critical that we stay small, efficient, 6, 8, at the most, say 10 permanent or salaried staff, put it that way, because we can do a lot of what we do through partnerships and through individual consultants. So it's important that we all know each other, that we actually know each other well. And that works far better than trying to grow towards an organization which in the end just has too many people, gets too bureaucratic. So lots more I could say, but I'll stop there.
Well, I was going to ask David, did you, when you first helped to set this up, when you and Dave had that kind of conversation in that hotel in Cairo, did you imagine that we'd get to where we are with the 10-year anniversary?
I suppose, yes, to be fair. Certainly the sort of size team that we have now, I wouldn't have envisaged that we were spread through quite as many countries. What is it, 10? Must be 10 countries probably that we've been working with. And of course, in the past, we've worked with other countries. I think what has really come about that we had hoped for 10 years ago, but didn't necessarily realize would happen, is that long-term part, that long-term commitment. And that's been so, in the past, when I look back 20 or 30 years at individuals, institutions who tried to do this sort of work, very often people who actually didn't know very much about the topic would go in, give them some equipment, a few drugs, spend 2 weeks, and then those people, the client would never see them again. And one of our great strengths, I think, is that we are able to pursue the work with a partner, and I thought the partner in the sense of a client partner, for long periods of time. Where Georgina's work with the bears in Japan, classic example. I mean, she's only talking about one instant. That instant took place after what, George, best part of 10 years probably, working with those parks and institutions in Japan on brown bears. So that long-term partnership is really, really, really critical. And that's, of course, that's what we'd hoped for from the beginning, to be a long-term partner.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for that insight, David. It's very fascinating to hear, and it makes me feel very lucky if we're always going to remain this small to be part of it. So Simon, one for you. When did you first hear about Wild Welfare? So what's your first memory of the charity?
Well, before I answer that, I'd just like to agree with David that, the thought of growing the staff numbers and having to have an HR department fills me with dread. So I'm more than happy to.
HR departments have some benefits, Simon. But I know what you mean.
No, nothing against people in HR, but yeah, the thought of managing 100 people would, it's yeah. Anyway, before I insult anyone else, So when did I first hear about wild welfare? I guess it was shortly before wild welfare and Yorkshire Wildlife Park started to plan the Japanese bear rehoming. I think George came and did a presentation at the park, and that's the first time I met George, and actually first time I heard about wild welfare. And yeah, and then we obviously started to talk about rehoming the bears and started to plan and prepare for that, and that was an interesting. I mean, I've obviously moved a lot of animals over the years working in zoos, but yeah, trying to move some bears out of Japan and not arranging all the flights and everything was quite a challenge, but it was obviously worth it in the end. And you can see I've got one of the bears behind me still, so it's a nice reminder of that.
Is that Hanako?
That's
No, that's one of the boys, isn't it?
yeah, that's one of the boys. Yeah. So yeah, that's the first time I heard about wild welfare, and obviously started to find out more about the organisation, and eventually here I am. About, I don't know, a year or so after the bears were rehomed, I left Yorkshire Wildlife Park and joined wild welfare.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because for people who didn't know, you were actually at Yorkshire Wildlife Park when we moved the bears, and then we poached you essentially over to wild welfare. So that's how it happened. You were too good for moving the bears.
Thank you, George. Appreciate that.
I was going to say, Simon, when you first found out about wild welfare, did you ever imagine yourself working for them?
That wasn't my first thought. No, not at all. I mean, I was very, very focused on the job at hand, and obviously being a professional, you know, I didn't have this very emotional experience being involved in that. But at the time, you're really focused on getting the job done, and even though, you know, doing all the paperwork, obviously, and then actually getting out there and planning and preparing to get the bears out of those cages into crates and then travel like halfway around the world back to the UK. You know, you're in the zone, making sure it all happens, and then afterwards, you know, you start to think about it and what you've done and all the good, and then obviously just carried on chatting with Georgina and the rest of the team, and yeah, and then that was it. I'm here.
And I think we've got a question. Did you guys want to do questions at the end, or do you want to look into this?
Well, I was going to ask you one, Sarah. You've been asking us questions, so I was going to ask you one, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So what's been the most challenging experience for you since you've been at wild welfare?
Well, there's
and you're not allowed to say anything about the staff.
No, there's an obvious one for me, which I'll go into in a second. One of the challenging aspects is I would love to, we obviously see a lot of issues, sometimes some quite distressing things, and you always want to be able to fix it right then and there. And obviously the way that we work, we create this long-term sustainable change, and sometimes those changes, they do take a while. And I think I always have that little bit of impatience that I kind of want to make things happen a little bit quicker, but we know how it works, and we know that it's an effective strategy. So it can be challenging, obviously, seeing some of the distressing elements and not being able to create that instant change. But I certainly know that the way in which we do create change really works for that long-term process. But for me personally, the challenge is always going to be my phobia. So for the people that don't know, I am ophidiophobic. So I have an intense aversion to snakes. Fears and phobias are very different things. And I actually have a great appreciation of snakes. I think that they're incredible creatures, but I just say that the wiring in my brain is a little bit different to everybody else's, and I have intense panic attacks upon sight, which makes it extra challenging when working out in the field with Dave, who is a herpetological expert and loves seeing snakes. So we're quite a pair when we work together. So it is a challenge, as well as obviously being in countries with a high prevalence of wild snakes. I do have to do a lot of welfare assessments and things on captive snakes. And it's always very anxiety inducing, but the way in which I get around that is just leaning on this absolutely incredible team who get it. They really, like, even if they don't necessarily understand how it all works, they're so on the ball about making it easier for me as much as they can. So Dave, the last time we were all out in Vietnam, he stumbled across a white-lipped tree viper, which I believe is venomous. And I had absolutely no idea until I got home, and the way in which he dealt with that, George dealt with it, and everybody is very incredibly understanding and supportive, and it's just, it's an amazing bunch of people, Wild Welfare. But the fact that you all just take this very, admittedly very strange aspect of me, and you just understand it and you support it, and we all have these workarounds to ensure that it isn't an issue, and for that I'm always so thankful. So that will always be my biggest challenge, but you guys are always going to be the solution.
Can I just say, it's not strange, it's a genuine phobia, and we understand that. But I do recall that trip specifically, and being torn between desperately wanting to see what David found and pretending to you there was absolutely nothing. And of course, when we're in a national park, there's going to be no snakes whatsoever. Don't be so silly, Sarah.
No, they don't care at all.
we did well, shielding you, I think. But it's a genuine phobia, and I think we always understand that. And I think you do tremendously well working in the industry you do with that. So it's been fantastic, I think.
And I would just like to qualify that this, we were actually walking back to our accommodation from supper through a patch of forest. I wasn't specifically looking for snakes. There just happened to be a tree viper in the road.
Yeah.
I was walking ahead of them, and I thought, right, I better make him go away before Sarah gets here. So I poked him with a piece of bamboo, and he slithered off into the grass.
You're a hero.
Yeah, what a gent, Dave. No, I believe you were protecting Sarah, but I don't believe you weren't looking for snakes. So.
No, there was one point, Dave, where you said, I want to come back here to look for snakes. And I think we were walking to breakfast one day, and you were like, this area is brilliant. And George was like, yeah, shut up. No, but the fact that you guys understand it and yeah, help me carry on with it is very much appreciated. So. But yes, once again, snakes are fantastic creatures. They're very essential for biodiversity, and I hope that everybody else present absolutely adores snakes. They need more champions.
Yeah,
all right.
So Sarah, yeah, well, I'll ask this question then, and then we'll go back to our sort of list of questions that we were going to ask each other. So this is from Selby Brereton, I think that's how you pronounce it. Yeah. And I think David sort of mentioned it already about the future of wild welfare, where there's potential for us to work. But Shelby wants to know, where do you see the most potential for wild welfare in the next 5 years? So,
do we need that in a geographical sense or in the sort of topics?
we can talk about both if you like, David. So yeah, David, do you want to?
Yeah.
Well,
sort of there's a number of factors in that. I mean, clearly we've already identified a lot of the countries and the regions where this is most needed. We know that there are some other areas, China particularly, we talked about, where it's extremely difficult to get in. I know George has tried to, with partners. This is again a good example of where partnerships in the welfare community, not necessarily with wild animals, but there's a huge potential, I think, in China, probably when things quieten down with Russia as well. Not that we need to try and find work at the moment. We know we've got more than enough to do. But I suppose in terms of potential, one of the things is going to be to get around the cultural challenges that we have. I mean, we're working particularly in Southeast Asia, where we know we have huge cultural challenges about what, how is welfare actually defined in the reasoning of many people. So I think there's quite a challenge in sort of looking at that in much greater depth. I think there's a challenge for us, which is also has a very high potential in developing ways in which we address different people. We've already, as I said earlier, we've already quite experienced with dealing with difficult people, and there are different areas of difficulty that we have to look after. So I think there are certainly challenges and potential there in sort of driving through, getting to the point where we can try and persuade others of the necessity of good animal welfare. So I think those are a few of the areas that have great potential, not only geographically, but also in developing our approach to the clients and the areas that we're already working.
Thank you, David. George?
Yeah, I just want to add to that, partly, so there's three areas in particular, I think, that we can lend our expertise to and expand into. I think one of those is exactly what David was just saying, which is human behavior change, which is a growing sector of the NGO sort of piece of work in terms of how do NGOs address animal welfare through human behavior change. However, it hasn't quite reached the zoo sector or the zoo industry in the capacity that it has perhaps in other areas. And I think that World Welfare has already been working on that through its programmatic work and its partnerships. And I think that's something that we will build on, and perhaps more strategically in the future. What will behavior change look like? What do we need to carry out effective and sustainable behavior change, both at the keeper level, at the governance level, and at the policy level? So another area I think that we will potentially expand into is how do we have sustained change at a national level? What kind of things need to happen? Who do we need to work with? What stakeholders are there? And we're already doing that in a number of countries, Vietnam, Japan, to say, just to mention a few of them, where we're trying to instigate change at the legislative and policy level. And that is so important, as well as obviously working on the ground with the keepers, with the people who run the zoos, with the public as well. I also think another area that is something that we're already involved with, and I think we will increasingly get involved with, is the tourist sector. So wildlife in tourism. It happens in multiple different ways. It happens correctly, it happens incorrectly, majority of the time. And World Welfare has already been an advisor to a number of tourist companies on how to ensure their animal welfare policies are appropriate. And I think that certainly the work I know that Simon has been doing with some of them, there is possible to expand on that and to use our sort of unique level of expertise, but also contacts within the zoological sector to support more effective animal welfare policies within that tourism industry. So I think that will be an area. And sorry, finally, Dave in particular, over the number of years, has worked very hard on developing a very sophisticated welfare auditing process, which World Welfare uses in a number of different ways. And I think that is another opportunity where we will roll that out even further, perhaps again in a more sophisticated manner, so that other people can use it and access it and develop it and adapt it for their own needs. And certainly over the last 10 years and the way we've used it, it's really helped organizations and institutions understand welfare from their own needs. And I think we'll be able to grow on that and develop that even further. So I think that will be another area of growth in the next 5 years. I'll stop there.
Thank you, George.
It's a very good
Sarah, you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, with George saying being able to meet people's needs, we had a comment recently from somebody who we'd gone through a welfare audit with, and they were actually saying that they loved it because the suggestions that we made were achievable and it was meeting their needs and what they needed to be able to direct these achievable attainments forward. So yeah, just always being aware of what is, yeah, we can look kind of long term, but also short term on what's achievable.
And our learning materials. I mean, this is a slight bit of promotion here for World Welfare, and I'm not meaning it to be, but I am so incredibly proud of the learning materials and learning module that Sarah really has put a lot of time and energy and expertise into, and they are phenomenal. And I think that we will be also looking to roll those out, and it's already a digital offer anyway, but I think we can even expand on that. It's translated into 3 languages now.
Moment, we're working on 4 and 5 at the moment.
I think it's just been from the feedback that we've had, people have said, oh, this is understandable, this is accessible, we get this. It's not overly complicated, but it is based on science. And I think that's a really amazing piece of work that you've done, Sarah. And that is something I think World Welfare definitely will be able to expand on over the next 5 years and use.
George, you always say that I did it, and thank you for that, but you honestly started it, and without those templates that you gave to me all those years ago, I would not have known where to start. So it was always a collaborative joint effort, and obviously Dr. Louise Connolly is a massive part of it as well, the Bacon as well. So it's always been a collaborative project.
The University of Edinburgh has been fantastic with that.
Thank you for bringing that up, George. That's why I asked Sarah. I was hoping, I was trying to prompt her to promote herself and big herself up a bit, but she's very modest, as we all are. So thank you, George. Dave, have you anything further to add to where you think there's potential for us in the next 5 years?
One of the areas that we've started looking at this, but at this point in time have not necessarily committed to specific projects, but is to be looking at human-wildlife conflict situations with wild animals as opposed to captive animals. With burgeoning human populations on this planet, human-wildlife conflicts now is becoming a literally everyday occurrence all over the world, particularly in a number of range states. But you know, even in one's backyard, human-wildlife conflict occurs, and there are welfare issues associated with that interaction. I mean, they don't call it conflict for nothing, and it's one of the areas that I would like us to start exploring, is looking at means of using the technologies that we've developed with captive animals as a means of mitigating human-wildlife conflicts with wild animals in the wild. Right now, most of the techniques used in human-wildlife conflicts are aversive. They involve either shooting at the animals, culling them, translocating them, but by and large, they're very punitive, for want of a better expression. Whereas with what we know from positive reinforcement training, with captive animals, I feel that there may be an opportunity that we need to look at quite closely of utilizing positive reinforcement training theory as a means of attempting to mitigate human-wildlife conflict. We're looking around at the moment for a potential project in that regard, but it's a difficult one. It's a very, very complicated one. So yeah, unfortunately, it could also be a little bit of a rabbit hole that we might vanish down. So you know, we've got to look very, very carefully at what we can practically do in situations like this. But yeah, it is definitely a possibility, I think, that we should explore.
Thank you, Dave.
Should mention, for those who don't know, when Dave says backyard, he is in rural South Africa, so it is literally for him in the backyard. Perhaps less so for us in the UK, for those joining us in the UK as well.
Well, yes and no, George. I mean, even in the UK, foxes and
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When we think of human-wildlife conflict, we immediately think of the big things like man-eating tigers and elephants destroying crops and things like that. But the fact of the matter is that human-wildlife conflict occurs all the time.
Well, absolutely, yeah. Yeah. Well, I know, but I just thought it was amusing, just in case people didn't know that, yeah, your backyard was actually in the middle of the bush, the amazing South African bush, and we're all very jealous of that.
Yeah, I have an active cobra at the moment. Yeah, he's wandering around the house and, well, the garden at least. And yeah, my solution for human cobra conflict is to catch them up and move them 100 meters away and hope that they don't come back. It doesn't work.
Oh, well, thanks for sharing your thoughts on wild welfare and your active cobra, Dave. I don't think anyone was expecting to talk about active cobras, but yeah, I mean, I don't
Sorry,
think
Sarah.
That's fine. We're just going to pretend that never happened and think about the kudu that you sometimes tell us about instead.
Yeah, I don't think I've got anything to add to that. I think that everyone's covered all the areas that we're sort of either working on or would like to work on and explore. But I think just to sort of sum it up, we sort of all our programs and projects are all sort of for the holistic approach to improving animal or wild animal welfare. So as Dave mentioned, you know, we're looking at projects where we can mitigate against human wildlife conflict, because quite often that's how animals come into captivity to start with. So we're trying to prevent that straight away. So again, that's removing the welfare issue straight away. And if they do come into captivity, then they get rehabilitated. And we're doing a lot of work now with I4, with their sanctuaries and rescue centres. So, you know, if they do come into captivity, they're cared for appropriately and rehabilitated and released. And if they have to spend the remainder of their life in captivity, then obviously we have all our resources and training and other programs to make sure that those animals have good welfare for the whole of their life, however long that may be. So yeah, we're always thinking about that holistic approach, whether it's, you know, and as we talked about, it takes years sometimes for these things to happen. So it's 5-10 year projects, programs, and we're always thinking of that holistic animal welfare approach. Sarah, did you want to start some more of the questions?
Yeah, so I've got one for you, George. If there's one thing that you've learned throughout your time with wild welfare, what would it be?
Patience.
Well, to be honest, that's exactly what sprung to mind was patience. But Sarah, you've already sort of touched upon this. So patience is absolutely key to something that I've tried to have during this whole process, and I'm still learning. But I wanted to then just sort of mention something else as well, and that is that we see a lot of suffering through the work that we do, but the majority of it, 90% of it, maybe even more, is not because of purposeful cruelty. It's not because people are purposefully mean. It's because people don't know what they're doing, don't have the time, or don't have the resources. And when I first started out in the animal welfare industry and working animal welfare, which is over 20 years now, I always just assumed whenever I saw animals suffering, it's because people didn't care and they were being purposely cruel, and sort of said you demonize those individuals. And through wild welfare and through working with people I never thought I would work with, I have met some fantastic individuals who were doing some pretty awful things to animals. They didn't know that it was awful. They sometimes thought it was okay because they weren't purposely being mean. So the majority of things that we see are changeable when you teach people that there are different ways to do things. And often, and we often talk about this with wild welfare, it isn't a resource issue. It is actually a software issue. It's not a hardware issue. And software issue meaning it's a people issue and it's changing their behaviors. Don't get me wrong, there are times when it is purposeful cruelty, and we will absolutely call them out when we see that. But more often than not, it's because people don't know they're doing something wrong. And that was something that took a while for me to get my head around, because I always just assumed that it was because people just didn't, you know, they were just hated animals, but it's not the case. So I think that's been really important for me to learn, because it also means that I've built relationships with people I wouldn't have, and got to know people, and that's all part of what wild welfare is about, working with people, trying to understand them and what drives them, to then help us understand how we can help the animals.
That's a really good point.
It's worth saying, I think, that the word patience was one of the reasons we started wild welfare in the first place. What we were seeing, when I was running London Zoo, it was a sort of height of anti-zoo movement. We're talking now about the 70s and the early 80s. And a number of organizations and individuals were what they thought they were doing correctly, while in criticizing bad zoos, was simply not working. The reason was impatience. And this was why, when we came together to found wild welfare, we knew the only way that we were going to get some traction with many of the organizations that were being criticized was to be patient and tolerant, and to give it long term, give it time. And in fact, that has proven, it's probably one of our great characteristics. One of the things that really stands out within wild welfare is the fact that we've achieved a lot because we have been patient, tolerant, and long-standing. And that's so important.
That should be a banner, shouldn't it?
It's quite a good example I have, where we've been working with a particular zoo in Thailand for quite a while, and got to know them all really well. And there were some common welfare issues, and we were addressing those. And I thought we were getting somewhere, and we were there. And I suddenly saw an orangutan for a photo opportunity, and a real bugbear of mine is photo opportunities with wild animals, particularly captive wild animals. And but because I'd known, and I knew the director of that zoo so well, he could take my slightly terse sort of approach when I sort of stormed into his room and asked him what was going on, and he was horrified. We then spoke to the keepers, and they didn't think anything was wrong. In fact, they thought it was enriching for those orangutans. They thought they would enjoy coming out and being photographed. So it was a combination of being able to speak honestly and directly to the director of a very big zoo, important zoo, and tell them what we thought was wrong, but also understand from the keeper's perspective why he thought it was okay. And they stopped that. And not only stopped that, but I think they also have been improving the facility for the orangutan as well. So it was quite a good example of both what David was saying and also trying to understand what drives people as well, which is so important.
And yeah, George, and to absolutely reinforce what both yourself and David have been saying, patience is obviously key, but we're all animal people, so to speak. But 90% of our work is with people. And I think this is one of the things that I like to think that we do rather well is we make friends, we establish relationships, and meaningful relationships as well. And that allows us to progress because we're not confrontational, we don't kick up a fuss. We look for practical solutions, and yeah, I can't think of any other way of putting it, is we make friends.
Well, and Dave, you're very good at that, because you always take one for the team and do the karaoke. And we seem to work in a lot of countries where karaoke is the place to bond. And I'll tell everybody, so Dave is fantastic at singing anyway, but he will always go out and do the karaoke. And often form some great relationships and decisions made over that karaoke. So I'm grateful for that, forever grateful for that.
As long as there's a few beers with it as well.
Yes, of course.
Definitely.
Well, I'm still yet to see Dave sing, so I'm looking forward to that day when it can happen. Heard legendary things.
Well, I had the karaoke evening last week with the director of Sabah Wildlife. I still have yet to tell you guys the outcomes of that. Karaoke works. I'm going to teach you all of you guys to sing, because it's a vital part of the work that we do. It really is.
That's a soft skill that we'll ask for in future applicants.
Actually, that's a good point you just made, Sarah. Actually, even though we've worked together or known each other for a few years now and longer, for some of us, actually the majority of the time this is how we communicate on Zoom. You know, we're spread all over the country and all over the world, either when we're at home or when we're traveling to various projects and places. So actually this is the most intimate we get, you know, quite often as a team, and I don't think we've ever been all of us in one room at the same time. There's been subsets, but yeah, it's we're a small, diverse, spread out team, which makes socializing quite difficult.
Yeah, David, I've never met you in person, have I? And Dave, I've only met you once. So.
Right. Yeah.
I remember meeting you for the first time, actually, Dave. It was 3 a.m. and I'd missed my flight. And we were in the middle of Vietnam, and I met you for the first time at 3 a.m, severely jet lagged. So it's a great impression to make.
I hope I didn't frighten you, Sarah.
No, it was the surroundings that frightened me more. Okay, so Dave, what wild welfare triumph has excited you the most over the years, do you think?
Wow, well, right now I'm kind of really focused on our work in Sabah, in North Borneo. We were able to arrange for 2 of the elephant caregivers at Langkawi Wildlife Park to do a month's intensive training at the Elephant Sanctuary in Tennessee, training in positive reinforcement and of course, obviously, protected contacts, elephant management. And what was an absolute privilege for me was to go back to Langkawi, and this was quite literally just last week, with these 2 guys that had spent their time in Tennessee. They were highly experienced people in their own rights, from wildlife departments, Sabah. They'd worked on elephant translocations in the wild and stuff like that. And the whole notion of protected contact was a very, very novel concept for them. And then, of course, we thrust them into the wilds of Tennessee. And there they're working with African elephants, almost twice the size of Bornean elephants. And what they learnt and experienced over there, and then they brought it back to Langkawi. It was absolutely amazing to actually see them using those skills that they'd learnt over there with their own elephants. And what a joy that was. That will stay with me for a very, very long time. And there've been, I like to think, a lot of triumphs and a lot of disappointments and failures. Indeed, we've had those as well. Over the years, over the past 10 years, we haven't been able to get back into Libya, for example's sake. We started working with Tripoli Zoo at one stage, but now, unfortunately, there's a militia camped in the zoo grounds, and from the point of, we've been advised that it's just simply not possible for us to come back right now. But yeah, and David has referenced this, as indeed has George. We make long-term commitments to our client partners. And it's lovely to see that gentle, sometimes maddeningly slow progression to that. It sounds pretentious, and forgive me for saying this, that level of enlightenment that we want to see occurring. And I had that privilege very, very recently in Sabah, as I say. So, yeah, we see a lot of distressing things, but we also see a lot of really good things as well.
Definitely. And yeah, those light bulb moments that you're talking about, Dave, they're when they do happen, they really soothe your soul a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've got another question from one of the audience. It's actually from Carl. Hello, Carl. I remember Carl. How you doing? I think Carl's question is more some I think it's after some free consultancy advice. So Carl works with as a pet boarder, and he has a lot of reptiles that come in. And I think his question is sort of asking if he sees or knows there's a welfare issue or health issue with a pet that he's caring for, how does he sort of approach or deal with the owner to address that welfare issue? So obviously we do on a grander scale, I guess, with a zoo or an association or even across the country, but you know, we also deal with people and individuals. So our last Dave as the resident reptile expert. Dave, how would you approach another reptile person to talk about a potential welfare issue with their pet or the animal they're looking after?
Yeah, the reptile guys are a pretty hard-headed lot. In terms of sort of reptile husbandry, there are very, very set ways of doing things, and in many respects that's a good analogy. But bearing in mind with our own philosophical approach to what we do on a larger scale, equally applies down to a smaller scale as well, so to speak. And were I in that position, and I actually have been on one or two occasions, the first rule is engagement. You gain nothing by being confrontational. You gain nothing by being accusatory. Bearing in mind that the person who's going to solve that problem is the person in front of you. So you need to find a way of being able to engage with that person in such a manner that they might start listening to you and lending some degree of credibility to what you're saying. Now, that's very easy to say. In practice, it is extraordinarily difficult, because we're dealing with a human condition, we're dealing with human personalities. It's got to be a case-by-case basis. There is no magic recipe here. Like I say, you've got to find some way of engagement, get that person into conversation, and quite often that may start with something that has absolutely nothing to do with animal welfare whatsoever. Look for the common ground. Look for a way of developing a rapport. By being argumentative or by being confrontational or accusatory, then you're shutting that person down straight away, and they're simply not going to listen to you. So yeah, I guess it's about kind of trying to develop people skills, and that's the weirdest thing for an animal person to have to admit.
I think, Dave, would you agree as well that quite often when we've worked with people, they're actually aware as well that there's a problem, but they're, for whatever reason, they're embarrassed or cautious or nervous or something to say something. And again, that's a very sort of good reason why you need to engage with that individual, find that common ground, get them to open up. And I imagine it is just the same on that one-to-one, or whether you're working with a bunch of keepers. They often realize that there's something wrong. They often know already. People aren't, blind. And I would imagine a lot of the people that or the animals that you're seeing with these health issues, the owners already know, but they may be too ashamed, they may be too nervous. And there's all sorts of reasons they may not do something. And so it's finding that common ground for that reason as well. I don't know, Dave, do you agree with that?
Yeah, completely, George. 9 times out of 10, the correspondent you're working with is usually well aware exactly as you just said, George, and for their own personal reasons do not want to admit to it. So you've got to kind of tease that out. Look, pride is always gets in the way of these things, ego and all of these things. But yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. 9 times out of 10, they know. In their heart of hearts, they know. And what you have to do then is try to create a safe environment where they can admit to it without losing face. Yeah, a bottle of whiskey sometimes helps. I found that very useful. Pull them into
That's for you, Dave.
Well, hopefully that's helped, Carl, and our consultancy fee invoice will be in the post to you shortly.
Well, guys, I just had one extra thing to add. I don't know if you agree, but also helping to provide solutions which are attainable, as we were saying earlier. We can look long term and big picture, and it looks really impossible. But if we just take those, as we always say in Vietnam, the baby steps towards those big steps, and just providing something to start off with that is easily achievable, and then the difficulty level essentially levels up to create that kind of more holistic overall change as well.
Definitely. Well, we've been going an hour now, and thank you for your questions. And so, Sarah, have you got any other questions that sort of we want to put to the team? We've got one more question. Oh no, there's a couple more questions in the chat now. So yeah, is there anything else you want to put to the team, Sarah? And we'll start to wrap up, I think.
Should we answer the questions in the Q&A, or rather than should we do that? Yeah,
can do. So we've got a Monique from Brazil. She works at a small zoo park in a city, and Dave knows Brazil and a lot of the zoos very well, so we might be aware of it, but she doesn't give the name of the zoo. But she's very new to zookeeping, and she was asking for some tips on what she could do to make a difference to improve the animal welfare at the institution. So what can a new keeper do to help improve the welfare of their animals? Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll say Sarah.
Sarah, definitely Sarah. Yeah.
Well, there might be a resource that we might have to help with that. Obviously, do take a look at our e-learning program. I'm assuming that Monique can speak English, but we are also hoping to translate that into Portuguese and Spanish at some point as well. But I would definitely say don't be afraid of speaking up. I know sometimes managers can have an agenda that possibly doesn't align completely with welfare. So if you are confident enough to speak up and provide the evidence as well. So as Wild Welfare, we always say we're very evidence-based, scientific approach, and we are always providing that evidence to back up what we do and to inspire our projects. So definitely look into the welfare science and keep up to date, because it is always changing. I always like to say animal welfare as a science is about as old as I am, so it is constantly growing, constantly evolving and changing. And back when I was at university, I was taught the 5 freedoms because that's what was kind of current, and now we've got the 5 domains, and even the 5 domains are changing and evolving constantly. So being aware of the nuances and all the new research into animal welfare as a science, and using that as evidence to back up what you want to do. And then also looking at this kind of holistic approach, so looking at the 5 domains, so environment of that animal, and then the nutrition and the health and the behavior, and seeing if you can create this idea of how these changes might be made. And we always take inspiration from the wild, don't we, guys? So, you know, if you're looking at behaviors that an animal would normally undertake in the wild, for example, then do they have the opportunities to undertake those same behaviors in your facility? And that's somewhere that I always like to start personally. I don't know if you guys have got anything to add to that.
No, I think that's great. I think that covers everything. And by all means, get in touch with us. Our contact information is on our website, wildwelfare.org. So by all means, reach out. There's lots of resources on our website for you to access, but please get in touch if you'd like to chat about this further. or have any particular questions for us.
Is the other thing I'd say. Definitely good luck.
Really interesting last question from Andrew Watson. Simon, I don't know if you want, are you happy for me to read it out?
Yeah, go for it, Georgia.
So Andrew asks, have you learned anything during your time at World Welfare that has either surprised you or challenged your professional understanding within that particular field? I've been thinking about that one. There's a few things, but I'm wondering, sort of maybe put this to David and Dave initially, what your thoughts might be on that. What during your time World Welfare, and I guess forming World Welfare, has anything particularly surprised you or challenged you from that professional understanding within this field?
George, can you just repeat the question again?
Yes. Have you learned anything during your time at World Welfare that has either surprised you or challenged your professional understanding within that particular field? I mean, very quickly for me, in terms of World Welfare, and the challenge is the number of different species that we have to work with. And although it's not a surprise, it shouldn't come as a surprise. Obviously, when you're walking around a zoo and potentially 300-400 different species in it, and welfare is about the individual, and it's also about the species needs. It's a challenge to be able to think on your feet and quickly be able to provide the information that you're being asked about a particular species. You'll move from a flamingo to a binturong to an elephant to a rhino to a bear, and you have to be able to know what those different species specific needs are, but also ask about that individual. And for me, that's always been quite challenging, and a steep learning curve as well. Perhaps not quite what you're asking for, but it was something certainly that I find working in the field that we're in. I don't know what anybody else thinks.
I think in general terms, wild welfare has given us as animal professionals the privilege of literally learning new things all of the time. Now, I know that's not what you're necessarily looking for, and it sounds in its own right a little bit pretentious, perhaps. But for me personally, as I mentioned earlier, I come from a reptile background, reptile husbandry. I operated a reptile park for 20 years. And I really thought that I knew something about reptile husbandry. The moment I started to seriously commit to welfare, per se, and what I started seeing coming out of welfare research has completely changed the way I think about reptile husbandry. And a lot of the practices that we see in the pet trade, and I'm afraid to say in zoos as well, is absolutely counter to the basic requirements of these animals, reptiles, snakes in particular, that we're actually keeping. There's this dual box approach where snakes don't need space. That is one of these mythologies that go on that are perpetuated in zoos. So the snakes are housed in plastic shoe boxes and in tiny enclosures and things like this. But now we know from, and as I say, we do adopt a science-based approach. We know from data, empirical data, that has come out of reptile welfare research. Snakes, for example's sake, all species of snake do this. They adopt what is known as a rectilinear posturing, where the snake stretches out and lifts its head up. And these are observations based on both wild snakes and on captive snakes. And rectilinear posturing is a very, very important component for virtually all species of snake. Now, when you confine a snake to a shoebox where it can't do that, that is an immediate welfare compromise. I know there'll be a number of reptile keepers and a number of reptile curators that would vehemently disagree with me on this, but there are published data. There are papers published on this particular point. And I have to say that initially, when I started reading these papers, I'm going, no, the way we've always done it in the past has always worked properly, so therefore we're going to carry on doing it. And being confronted by these data, these published data, has forced me to completely change my viewpoint on how we go about reptile husbandry. And I'm glad for that. Life has got to be a learning curve, and and that's what it's all about at the end of the day, is remaining open to what's coming out of animal welfare research now, particularly in the cognitive sciences field. I mean, some of this stuff is absolutely mind-blowing, and it has completely altered the way I look at captive animals, captive wild animals, generally speaking.
But the thing is, Dave, you. Sorry,
Sarah. I was about to say that's. I think the reptile lecture has come to an end. Thank you, Dave. No, that was awesome, and I couldn't agree more. And I think, I think we've got to the end of everyone's limit of a Zoom call now. So I really do appreciate for everyone sticking with us and listening to us, and for your questions. I hope it's been fun. I don't know if anyone's got sort of, if we all have one last sort of sentence to wrap up what we think, how, I don't know, is
no, go and have a good weekend and relax. And I'm sure you've worked hard for animals. Most of you, I'm sure, are working in the animal sector, and you've worked hard for animals this week. You'll work hard for animals next week. So go and enjoy your weekend now. And for those working over the weekend, good luck as well. But
exactly, well, that's what I was looking for, George. So thank you.
Oh, there you go.
So if no one else has got anything they'd like to say, I'd just like to say thank you again for joining us. Thank you for supporting wild welfare. We couldn't do it without your support. As we've said many times, it's all about partnerships, relationships, and working together to get the job done. So we really do appreciate all the support we receive from everyone. So thank you again, and goodbye.
Thanks, team.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.